it's a little bit of Alice in Wonderland here in a scary way. Having legislators have the time to focus on a $1.5 million pot of money for this, annual report, or $3 million for this alcohol research, it's just very, very difficult. The vast majority of Americans want their government to protect them from harm, and
it's unlikely to escape anyone's notice that America is living through some eventful times in recent months. Health has been very much part of it, and alcohol along with that. So I'm very grateful to welcome Mike Marshall, CEO of the US Alcohol Policy Alliance, to try and help make some sense of it. Welcome, Mike. Thanks very much for joining me.
Well, thanks, Phil. Greetings from Portland, Oregon.
And greetings from Vienna. As I alluded to in the introduction there's an awful lot been going on in the last few months, and it's perhaps a little bit too much to deal with all of it. But perhaps you could give us a kind of potted overview of some of the big sort of big ticket items over recent history.
Sure. Every day things are changing in this country very rapidly, and so. But since the beginning of the year, since the beginning of the Trump administration, we've seen a major deconstruction of government in general, but specifically around public health policy in this country. The Center for Disease Control, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, other departments like that are all seeing longtime staff fired, seeing massive layoffs. Now the government is shut down for the last 2 weeks, so no one is working. And so we're seeing a systematic dismantling in terms of alcohol programs. And meanwhile, Congress doesn't seem to be stopping it in a meaningful way. So we're very much in flux right now. The big sort of policy issues from the point of view of the alcohol, harm prevention movement, which I'm the CEO of the US Alcohol Policy Alliance, we're focused on making sure that there's money in next year's budget for addressing underage drinking. It's called the STOP Act, and has been very successful. It's a really tiny program, should be much bigger, but the Republicans are trying to gut that as well. And then the larger issue around policy relative to alcohol is every 5 years, the government issues dietary guidelines that include how much alcohol is recommended someone consume to be, drinking safely. And we had hope that the U.S. would follow the World Health Organization and Canada and a few other countries and say there's no safe level of alcohol consumption. It's a toxic, addictive carcinogen and people should know that. That's not to say we should be telling people not to drink. We should just make sure people know the risks associated with drinking. And we didn't expect to get that far this year, but we thought the current recommendations are for 2 drinks a day for men and 1 drink a day for women. And we were hoping to get it down to 1 drink a day for men and 1 drink a day for women, both of which still have substantive and significant health risks associated with that level of consumption, but would have been an improvement, a dramatic improvement, particularly for men. However, the dismantling and deconstruction of our public health system at the highest level, it now appears, according to media reports, that they're not going to recommend when they're issued, they're not going to recommend any level, like 2 drinks, 1 drink, whatever. They're just going to suggest drink responsibly, which is exactly what the alcohol industry wants, right? Because it's an unmeasurable concept, and it places the burden simply on consumers, and that it absolves the industry of any burden relative to the fact that it's killing 178,000 Americans each year. It's a major carcinogen. It plays an instrumental role in suicide deaths and gun violence deaths and domestic violence, and not to mention poverty, incarceration, and many of the ills of society. So we're very, very much in flux, and it's not going in the right direction.
And in terms of the labeling issue that you mentioned at the end there, is there any means to push back against the current direction of travel?
So we've been trying to do that. We tried to meet with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert Kennedy Jr., We've been putting pressure on them, but it's clear that they're going to ignore any of that and all of that. As a consequence, U.S. Alcohol Policy Alliance, we issued our own set of guidelines on alcohol consumption that we hope then the press, when the government releases there, will have something to compare it to. And we just flat out said there's no safe level of alcohol consumption, and articulated all the links. And if you go to our website, alcoholpolicy.org, you can find those recommendations, and I urge people to do that and to share them with far and wide.
And I suppose a kind of a cynic or whatever might say, oh well, these nobody pays any attention to these recommendations anyway. So is it really going to have an impact on the sort of welfare of American alcohol consumers?
It's a great question. You know, I started in this role in January, and we were already in the thick of this fight, and it seemed to me like the dietary guidelines, who pays attention to them. But if you actually Google now, particularly with AI, what is the safe level of alcohol consumption, those U.S. dietary guidelines more often than not come up as the recommendation. And so when you think about, or if you go into your doctor and say, hey, how much should I be drinking? They will say 2 drinks a day for men, 1 drink a day for women. So, and the New York Times or the, TV station, local TV stations, when they're doing stories about alcohol, they will use that data, those statistics or those recommendations rather. And so it actually permeates the conversation around alcohol in a way that we don't necessarily initially appreciate. And so I think it is a very important fight that we're having, and knowing in advance that we're going to lose the fight doesn't mean we don't still continue to sort of leverage the fact that the administration is going to go backwards on this to try and illuminate that backward motion as much as possible, so that people understand that it's really not a valid recommendation on their part. It's not a safe recommendation.
And so, sort of peeling back the layers of problems you've mentioned, that one of them was that the government shutdown and the budgetary cuts that you mentioned. I mean, I ask once again, what if anything can be done to push back against that?
So, we have to wait for the government to reopen, and then we have to figure out how they're going to reopen it. Are they going to pass these bills that have cut money from underage drinking and, have cut the Center for Disease Control, alcohol research programs and all that sort of stuff? Or will what we have, not to get too much in the weeds, but what Congress does here often is pass continuing resolutions, which basically adopts last year's appropriations and just moves them forward so that they can get the doors of the government back open, and because they can't make a decision, and then they just keep doing these continuing resolutions until it's a new budget year, because we operate with 2-year budgets. And so that's my conclusion, or my thought is what's going to happen, which is good. It just means last year's level of funding will be kept in place. It won't be cut this year. So the Stop Act, the underage drinking program, will be funded at the level it was last year, which is all we were asking for again this year. Okay.
And before this sort of immediate crisis, there was a crisis before that, which was that, as I understand it, the Health and Services, the Health Department was cutting funding and indeed cutting jobs within the CDC's alcohol and tobacco department, which is a sort of maybe more of an ideological decision than a budgetary one. Do you have any more insight into what is going on there now?
Well, yeah, I think, this whole, the Trump administration and, what they call the DOGE, and I can't remember what DOG stands for, but they're just trying to deconstruct government, period. And, public health, the Center for Disease Control, all was harmed reputationally during the COVID pandemic. The anti-vaccine folks who are now in power in the White House, and the CDC was on the front lines of, recommending that we shut down, that we wear masks, that we, delay, shut down the schools. And so they came out of that really harmed in the political process in terms of Republicans in particular having a great deal of animosity towards them. In fact, 2 months ago, a shooter showed up with a gun outside the headquarters and shot 500 bullets into the windows of all the offices of the CDC. Thankfully, it was a Sunday. There were still people there working because they went in on the weekends, because the people that work at the CDC are there because of the work and not because of the pay. So it's against that backdrop that it's been really easy. And there are so many cuts at so many levels. You know, here in Portland, they're trying to send troops in to control the streets, claiming that there's huge protests going on, and really there's 4 guys in a frog outfits down out in front of the immigration control offices. So we live in it's a little bit of Alice in Wonderland here in a scary way, and it makes it hard to fight for any one thing because there are the Trump folks use a U.S. football analogy, which is they flood the end zone, which is just to put so many people there that they don't know who to cover. Like the whole defensive and offensive team goes into the end zone, and the defending team doesn't know who's going to get the ball. And that's kind of what they're doing here. They're just overwhelming everyone. And these programs are small financially. You know, the Stop Act is $20 million out of HHS's $15 billion budget. And so when there's $100 million cuts happening, having legislators have the time to focus on a $1.5 million pot of money for this annual report, or $3 million for this alcohol research, it's just very, very difficult.
I suppose, yeah. I mean, my zone has been well and truly flooded, I have to say, from trying to cover it from afar. But
right.
What is curious as an outsider of the Trump coalition in general, but is that it encompasses people who I guess are really on the sort of libertarian market, free market side to some degree, and then there's also people who are pretty conservative on social issues, which one might expect might include some people who are not somewhat skeptical about the effects of alcohol, including Trump himself, who is not like a non-drinker. So, right. If there is there a crumb of hope to be found in that, or is that just flooded out by everything else?
Yeah, well, that's the $10,000 question. So Trump allegedly has never had a drop of alcohol, and he talks openly about hostility towards alcohol because he's seen it destroy people's lives. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, the person in charge of the dietary guidelines, Bobby Kennedy, he's been clean and sober for 25 years. He goes to AA meetings. He talks about his recovery. The chief of staff to the president, her husband is many years in AA, and she talks openly about that. So arguably, this should be the best administration ever for us. Joe Biden didn't drink either, and had, as we well know, his children have all had addiction issues. But the Trump administration is also, the most anti-regulatory, pro-business administration in 100 years, radically so. The vast majority of Americans want their government to protect them from harm, and the best way to protect people is to make sure they have the knowledge they need to make the best decisions for themselves and their families. We all take risks. I'm 64 years old and I still go up and ski, and that's a much risky behavior than it was when I was 30 years old, right? But I know that. I make that decision. That's how I want to live my life. The same should be true of alcohol. But when we are not providing people with the information they need about the science of alcohol and the fact that it's a toxic, addictive carcinogen that has nothing but adverse impacts on our health, by not sharing that, you're hiding that. And we have to get, and the Trump administration, I would argue, if they come through with these dietary guidelines that they leak to the press, then they are intentionally misleading the American public. And that is a significant problem.
Okay.
And I don't think that's libertarian. I don't think that's conservative. I think that's just dishonest.
Okay, and one less sort of in the last in the weeds question before I'll ask you just kind of a final one is about a few months ago I did a little bit of a list of projects which have been defunded by the Trump administration. I think a part of this Doge campaign, about $31 million worth of research programs. Is there any news on what's happened to them? Are they still on the precipice?
Yes, they are. And in fact, they laid off, I think, another 1,000 workers last Friday. So I think that Congress can intervene here. Like I said, they may reopen the government, allocating the same level of money for this fiscal year, which just started that we had last year, which would be a win. But we just have to recognize that this is an administration that is really trying to deconstruct government, and so we have to get through the next 3.5 years, and hopefully then the Democrats come back in power. We will then have an opportunity, right? So he's deconstructing programs that have been built, I don't even want to say systematically, because they haven't necessarily followed a direct line of thought or reasoning or objectives. They've just been, like government does, as it grows, as it adds on and on and on. And so there are probably some programs in there that were outdated or, not reflecting the most recent science or whatever the case may be. So if there's a silver lining here, is that 3-4 years from now, we're going to have the opportunity to reconstruct and do so hopefully in a manner that is more 21st century in terms of the origins and the purpose of the government work. But an awful lot of harm is going to happen before then, and so it's hard to even look at that silver lining.
Okay, well, to sort of finish on hopefully a more positive note, I mean, the US Alcohol Policy Alliance is a fairly young organization. I think you said you started earlier this year. Maybe you could give us a little bit of an outline of your plans for the next the next year or so.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that opportunity. So the USAPA is our acronym, USAPA. So USAPA has been around for about 15 years, but it was volunteer driven. It had a board of directors. And we hired consultants here and there, and our primary purpose was to put on the U.S. Alcohol Policy Conference every other year. And then in January, and I served on the board the last few years, in January, we hired a CEO. That was me. I'm the first staff person. So it's my responsibility to take the organization from being a reactive organization to a proactive organization. And part of that is securing funding for our work. And this is a tough year to be out there raising money for, approaching donors, whether they're, foundations or whether they're high net worth individuals. There's so much going on that people are being asked for money. It's a difficult objective, but we adopted 3 primary objectives earlier this year. One is to lead the development of a national alcohol prevention strategy. The second one is to build the capacity of state level organizations or coalitions to be able to engage in state level alcohol policy work. Given the next 3 years at the federal level, we're going to be a little bit in the wilderness. And then the last is just to bring money into the movement, not just to fund USAPA, but to fund these state-based groups, to fund a litigation strategy like that was proved so successful in the tobacco effort and in the opioid effort, to fund a public education campaign that really targets the way alcohol is represented, whether it's in entertainment or, in the news or whatever the case may be. So, but to try and bring in at least $10 million a year, currently there's no institutional funders. We have operated with a database of about 10 or 20 donors each year at an average of $50 a month. Or $50 a year. So we're building from scratch that effort. But again, come up with a national strategy, what I call a North Star project, build capacity at the state level to move alcohol policy laws in states that are more friendly to it. And then lastly, bring money into this larger movement so that we can drive down the harms and prevent the harms associated with alcohol.
Well, it sounds like a noble cause. I'm sure many of the viewers will be very sympathetic to it, and maybe it can lend a hand. So, many thanks for sparing the time. It's been extremely useful to try and make sense of what is an extremely complicated situation.
Yeah, well, as always, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our work, and I really appreciate the work you're doing, Phil, as well.